Okay, I hope actually that most people, in fact I hope everybody here is in the same situation as the chair, in which case I shall get away with everything. Because what I'm going to do is tell basically a story about something which I assume lots of comrades don't know about. Japan was the only, in a sense, 19th century, what we might call third world country that made it, in a sense, to the first rank of capitalist powers. And that's really due to the revolution which happened in Japan in the 1860s, which is known as the Meiji Restoration. It's a very odd event in some ways because, certainly in terms of what we might think about European bourgeois revolutions, because this was a revolution led by members of the old aristocratic military caste, the samurai. And they did it in the name of restoring the dignity of a line of emperors who went back to the 7th century AD. And so it's called the Meiji Restoration. They restored the Meiji emperor to his powers. And it seems an odd thing for a bourgeois revolution to be. First of all, it's the section of the aristocracy which carries it out, and it's done in the name of restoring the imperial dignities and powers. How can this be, in fact, a bourgeois revolution? I'll ask this question at the beginning and say something about it and then come back to it at the end. I want to refer you, if you want to pursue this question, to, I think, a very important article by Alex Kalinikos in the, I think it's IS 43. Anyway, it's the Great French Revolution issue of 1989. He has an article on bourgeois revolutions and historical materialism. And he makes a very important point that bourgeois revolutions are not necessarily the result of conscious action by a class of capitalists, by a class of bourgeoisie. That what makes a bourgeois revolution is its outcome. As he puts it, that a bourgeois revolution is a revolution that promotes capitalist development. The question you have to ask about a revolution, if you want to ask whether it's a bourgeois revolution, is who benefits, which class benefits? And if the answer is the capitalist class benefits from it, then fundamentally this is what makes it a bourgeois revolution. Now, I think we can put the matter a little bit more precisely. Alex isn't here, so I can speak very freely here. I think he's a little imprecise in his formulation. Certainly if we apply this to the Meiji Restoration in Japan, then a bourgeois revolution, firstly we have to remember bourgeois revolutions are national revolutions mostly. They occur in particular states. So we're talking about a revolution in a particular country, a particular nation state, which promotes a national capitalist development. In a sense, capitalism would have developed in Japan anyway. After all, capitalism has developed in a sense that it set the parameters of development in Ethiopia. Capitalism would have become the predominant mode of production, shaping development in Japan, whether or not there had been a Meiji Restoration. The question, really, which the Meiji Restoration was about was which section of the world capitalist class was going to dominate that process. Would there, in fact, form in Japan a new centre of capital accumulation, a new and dynamic centre of capital accumulation? In a sense, the achievement of those who carried through the bourgeois revolution in Japan was that they carved out a space in the world economy in the 19th century for themselves. And they joined, therefore, they were able, therefore, to enable Japan as a nation state and as a bunch of local capitals, as it were, to be combined together to join the competitive race within world capitalism. And in many senses, Japan's revolution of the 19th century was, I think, the most significant anti-colonial revolution after the 1776 American Revolution. On the other hand, one has to say that the setting in which it occurred and the old society that it had to cope with and overthrow and the tasks that it faced were very different from those facing George Washington and his comrades, and his slave-owning comrades, we should say. Let me tell you what happened, basically. Fundamentally, I'm going to tell you a story. In 1853, they sailed into the harbour in front of what is today called Tokyo, in those days called Edo, a fleet of warships from the United States under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. And he arrived in what was supposed to be forbidden waters to foreign shipping, and he announced to the government in Edo that he had come with a message from the President of the United States, and they'd better receive this message, and the message was, you must open up Japan to the world. You must accept a treaty with the United States. If you don't, he said, well, I'll show you the consequences, and he got his warships to fire off blanks in a military salute to the Emperor of Japan. He made it quite clear that he had the capacity to sail up the bay to the city of Edo and shell it to bits, and that there was nothing the Japanese would be able to do to defend themselves. And he said quite simply, that's my message, here is a toy train set for you, which he brought to shore with a military band and so on. He said, I'll be back in the spring for your answer. And when he returned in the spring, he forced open Japan. The Japanese signed a treaty. The Americans were very quickly followed by the British and the French and the Russians and others who also got treaties, and Japan was opened up, first of all, to having to accept foreign consular officials on their territory, and then to accepting trade treaties, and so on and so on. This was a forced imperialist intrusion into Japan, beginning in the 1850s. Now, to understand the reaction, what happened in response to this, you have to understand Japanese society before 1853. And that's why I've given you this little handout, if you all got it, just a sort of map. What existed in Japan was a form of society in lots of ways very different from what existed in feudal Europe or early modern Europe. There was the reason I call it the official class system, it was a legally defined, centrally state-defined system of classes that existed, or what some people would call a status system, a legally defined class system. Right at the top, officially, is a figure called the Emperor, but the Emperor is actually a completely powerless figure living in a palace in Kyoto, where, in fact, he lives on a pension given to him by his military commander, so-called, the shogun. And he's actually completely restricted. He carries out various rituals during the year to the gods, and he lives in an area. He's never allowed to leave this area. It's about the size, as one historian put it, of the deck of a modern American aircraft carrier. And he's a prisoner in this area, and he and the nobles around him, who are also completely powerless politically, receive pensions from the shogun, and are told to carry on doing the rituals. And that's it. This is a completely powerless figurehead. The real ruler of Japan is the shogun, or shogun, I'm never sure how you pronounce this. He doesn't live in Kyoto, he lives in Edo, modern Tokyo. And his full title, I've forgotten the full, it isn't just shogun, it's shogun something, which means generalissimo for the expulsion of barbarians. And that's the meaning of his title. And he lives in Edo, and he's a member always, this system has existed now since the year 1600. A very convenient year in terms of our calendar. From the year 1600 onwards, this system is established in Japan after a series of civil wars. And always a member of the Tokugawa family takes the office of shogun. And when the Tokugawa seized power and took over the shogunate in 1600, they divided the land of Japan up. And they carefully allocated the lands of Japan to various families, noble families or great lord families, military families, on the basis, basically, of where they had fought in the battles by which the Tokugawa had come to power. So to their total enemies, they slaughtered. Those who had fought on their side, they gave them land. First of all, they took the land closest to Edo for themselves and for their vassals. The next wave, groups of land outside, further out, they gave to their closer friends, and to those who'd only switched right at the last minute to supporting them, or who'd offered them submission rather late in the day, they put right at the edge. So there were inner and outer and large and small lords, all of whom were in charge of areas of Japan for which the Japanese term is han. We might use a term like county to get some sort of sense of what the size of these territories was, because Japan is a country not so dissimilar to the British Isles in terms of size and population and so on. So we have a series of lords, each of whom has a piece of territory, all of whom owe obeisance in some sense to the Tokugawa shogun. Beneath them, there is a very important class in Japan known as the samurai. And these are the guys you may have seen in the movies with the top knot and the two swords. A long sword for chopping off the heads of peasants, which they were legally entitled to do without any legal redress from the peasants, if they felt like it, and a short sword for disemboweling themselves in cases of disgrace. You could be ordered by your lord, for example, to commit seppuku, to kill yourself in some situation of personal disgrace, or where you brought disgrace on him, or something like this. And so the samurai always carried the two swords. It was a sign that they were the only class allowed to carry arms in 17th, 18th, and first half of 19th century Japan. This is a fixed class system. Nobody is allowed to move into the samurai class officially unless they have been born into the samurai class, and nobody's allowed to move out of the samurai class either. You're not allowed, if you're a samurai, to engage in trade. You're not allowed to engage in farming or in artisanal activity. Below them, there are then, in terms of how the Tokugawa saw it, there are the peasants constituting 75% of the population. Below them are the artisans, people who make things like the swords for the samurai and lanterns and all sorts of other goods and so on. And finally, right at the bottom, the really dirty people, the merchants. These are the people who handle money. And this is the lowest activity of all. So this is an aristocratic picture of the world. And there's this fixed class system. Above all, there is this very strong limit on the right of people to enter or leave the samurai class. It's above all the protection of this class's privileges, which this whole system is partly concerned to achieve. Now, this is a system which is very tightly controlled and policed for a period of 250 years. It's one of the longest lasting and most stable free capitalist systems, certainly of the early modern world. The Tokugawa closed Japan in the early years of the 17th century. They simply said that they would allow no ships to come to their shores other than 2 Dutch ships a year. They expelled the Portuguese and the Spanish who brought Christianity to Japan. They slaughtered all the Christians that they could find in Japan. They expelled Christianity as a dangerous, threatening political force to their own rule. And they allowed 2 ships a year to come to Nagasaki Harbour. And they carefully inspected these ships when they came to make sure they had no Bibles on board. But it gave them a little window onto the rest of the world. They learned about European science, for example, through this little window. They had people, particularly in the 18th and the early 19th century, became increasingly interested in what they called Dutch studies. Particularly after Japanese doctors discovered that Western medical textbooks were much more reliable than Chinese textbooks about such things as the interior of the human body. And so on. They carried out experiments in which they discovered the advantages of Western medical science. They became increasingly impressed by this and by other aspects of Western science. But they were very careful to control what literature was allowed to come in, who was allowed to read it, and so on. They maintained control over the various lords by insisting on a system of what they called alternate attendance. That's to say, if you were a great lord in Satsuma, right down in the south of Japan, for example, one of their traditional enemies, or if you were any other lord for that matter, every year you had to travel to Edo for half the year, which was an extremely expensive process for you. You spent a lot of your local resources on this because you had to take with you hundreds of attendants and samurai and porters and so on and so on. You had to maintain several official residences in Edo as well. You had to spend 6 months in the court of the shogun and then return to your ham again after 6 months. And when you went, you had to leave your wife or wives, children behind in Edo as hostages for good behavior. In this way, this was a method of making sure, preventing any kind of threat of rebellion by any local lords against them. Largely speaking, this was a system which involved, in the centre, most of the politics. To the extent you can talk about national politics in this 250-year period, it is the preserve of a small number of people. All of them men, of course. I mean, I have to say that women do not figure in the story which I'm going to tell. They never become a central presence in Japanese politics really until the 20th century. The vassals of the shogun, the people who were small lords who'd been attached to the Tokugawa house, actually did most of the government of the shogunate, because in many ways the shogun himself very often was, rather like the emperor, a symbolic figure. It was his civil servants, if you like, made up of small lords who conducted a lot of the business, most of the business, and who had an interest in maintaining the Tokugawa system because they, in fact, got all sorts of perks and rewards and, of course, power out of their association with the house of the shogun, of the Tokugawa. the great members of the Tokugawa house were actually forbidden to participate in politics. They were not allowed to participate in the decision-making process unless they actually got to be shogun. In the local areas, again, remember the lord is half the time he's out and he's not in his own hand. He's travelling backwards and forwards on the roads. He's also very often a ceremonial figure. The real government of different local areas of Japan is carried out by high-level and middle-level samurai. They are the people who do most of the government of Japan. So there's an official system, if you like, and then the real work is being done by middle and higher-ranking layers of the samurai class. Within this, this is a period, really from 1600 right through to the middle of the 19th century. Japan is a remarkably stable system. However, politically, that's to say there are no significant wars, and so on and so on. However, within this system, there is a considerable process of change and development going on. One of the effects of the introduction of the Tokugawa system was that all the samurai were taken off the land. They had been warrior peasants, rich peasants, if you like, in medieval Japan, with swords. The peasantry was disarmed, the samurai class was declared to be the only class which could carry arms, but they were taken off the land and concentrated into castle towns as servants of the lord or of the shogun. The result was that they became, not like feudal lords or feudal knights, attached to the land with their own peasants, with property interests in the land and so on. They became bureaucrats. They were paid salaries. These salaries were actually paid to them in bales of rice, which they then had to convert through the merchants into money because you needed a lot of money to live in town. One of the effects of this concentration of the samurai class into the castle towns of the various up and down Japan, but of course also into Edo, the capital of Japan, was that there was an enormous process of urbanization in Japan. By the middle of the 18th century, Edo was the largest city in the world. It had a population of over 1 million. It was much bigger than any European city, and the growth of this city and of all the castle towns was something that promoted a very rapid process of commercialization inside isolated Japan. So that the merchants, who of course got all the profits out of this commercialization, actually became very wealthy. In the countryside, there was a great deal of peasant resistance to being taxed by the samurai class. Of course, this is an exploitative system. We must never forget this. The basis of exploitation was the collection of taxes from Japanese villages, collected above all in rice or in substitutes for rice. The peasants resisted taxation, but the result of the peasant class struggle in this period, in the 17th, particularly in the 18th and the 19th century, was that actually the peasants managed to keep some of the resources to themselves. Within the villages, rich peasants grew up, who actually could live very often better than members of the samurai class. The merchants, many of them, became extremely wealthy, lived much better than members of the samurai class. So you had this curious disjunction, if you like, between the official hierarchy, in which the samurai is not only the armed class, the ruling class, but also ought to be best off class. Actually, many of the lower levels of the samurai reduced by the early 19th century to having to carry, actually, without telling anybody, a bamboo sword inside the case of their sword, or they pawned their sword, or they hadn't actually got a sword, or when they had to go on guard duty, they borrow one. Some of them are actually engaging, without ever admitting it, because it was terribly shameful, in artisanal activity. They were making baskets in the back of their little house, or whatever. You have actually a very dissatisfied, in many ways, layout of this, it's a large class, 6% of the population. It's rather larger than the English aristocracy and knighthood together as a proportion of the population. Right, I'm going to have to speed up a bit. Okay, so you've got a situation, in a sense, in which there's all sorts of potential for social disorder in Japan already before the arrival of the bursting open of Japan from the West. This change was contained, however, for 250 years. One of the key things that contains it is the fact there are no internal wars. There is not the kind of effect on development that comes from the enormous processes of wars in the early modern period in Europe, which promotes development, economic development in all sorts of ways. But there is a process of slow economic development and commercialization going on by the time the Americans arrive. There are lots of peasant revolts, but they always manage to contain them. They never actually challenge the state and so on. They're localized and so on. They become more and more developed as the 18th century and the 19th century go on. there are lots of critics amongst the samurai class, literary critics of the system, who begin to talk about how things ought to be more rational, there ought to be more careers open to talent, for example. They become more and more dissatisfied with the fact that certain families are hogging all the good positions, and so on, and there's various schools of criticism, but they're carefully censored by the shogunate and their police, and they're also, they remain at the level of literary discussion. There are no movements attached to them, you might say, until certainly, there's one in 1837, a samurai official actually leads a riot in the city of Osaka, but it's not a very big affair. What the imperialist intrusion from the 1850s does is completely disrupt this system. Firstly, the shogun, remember his title is Generalissimo for the expulsion of barbarians. He has lost legitimacy somewhat as a result of having to sign all these treaties. All of a sudden, he cannot expel the barbarians, and his whole system is thrown into, is delegitimized massively just by the fact that he signed treaties. They lose sovereignty over part of the Japanese territory, because what the British and the Americans and so on did was to insist on what they called the treaty port system, which they'd imposed on China from the 1840s after the Opium War. That's to say that a piece of territory becomes extraterritorial, as they called it. It becomes, if any Englishman, for example, who commits a crime on Japanese soil is not subject to Japanese justice, he's subject to British justice. People are they intervene militarily on behalf of any of their citizens that they feel have been in any way wronged and so on. One Englishman called Richardson was killed by a party of samurai on a road outside Yokohama, and they demanded an indemnity of 3 million Mexican dollars, and when they didn't get it, they went and shelled the city of Kagoshima in Satsuma in the south of Japan and killed hundreds of people, in return for this insult to one Englishman. The price, big racist sort of measure, and so on and so on, such as you'd expect from the British Empire abroad. The impact of the opening of Japan was to cause considerable economic disruption. There was massive inflation in Japan in the 1850s and 60s once trading had started. All sorts of everyday relationships and so on were disrupted by this and so on. And there's the disruption of these military interventions, the shelling of Kagoshima in 1863, the shelling of Shimonoseki in 1864, and the collection of an even larger indemnity, as they called it, for what they saw as an insult to them in Shimonoseki, when they demanded an indemnity worth 1/3 of the government's budget for the year. So they're coming in and they're disrupting and so on and so on. Faced with this, there's really a choice for Japan. Either Japan, in a sense, becomes like other colonial countries. There's one possibility. It's an obvious possibility for Japan. It could become like India. It could be colonized by a single power and turn into another small jewel in somebody's imperial crown. It could, like China, be divided up and broken up and so on as the result of the impact of a number of imperialist intrusions. That's one possibility, and therefore it can become a backward society in the world economy. The other possibility is that those who rule Japan, or those who get hold of rule in Japan, somehow find a way to join the imperialist state system. That's the choice, really, as a player. Not as a subordinate player, but as an active and equal player with other powers in the world. What that would mean is, firstly, that you have to revolutionize the political system in Japan, and secondly, you have then to develop your economic and military power to be able to be a proper player in the world system, a predatory, imperialist pirate, like all the rest of them. Which is, the interesting thing about Japan is that the Japanese, what emerges after 1868 is a government that precisely manages to follow that second road, which is what makes the Japanese development so interesting. The key I'm going to have to very, very quickly summarize what happens in the period of the 1860s, really. The key effect of the opening of Japan was to open up politics. New layers of the population get involved in politics who have previously been excluded. Firstly, the lords and the lords themselves from the different Han, some of them become involved in the politics of the shogunate, the politics of the court. The imperial court itself, which has been shut out of politics for the previous 2.5 centuries, becomes itself a centre of political debate and argument and toing and froing of parties and so on and so on. The peasants, because of the disruption of economic life and so on, themselves become they become, now it would be wrong to say political actors, they become the peasants are revolting is a well-known phrase. The peasants, indeed, there are lots of peasant revolts, particularly in the later 1860s, in the 2 years before the actual revolution. I'll come back to this very quickly at the end. The key people who become active are the middle and lower layers of the samurai class. They become politically active, they take on a name for themselves, a title for themselves. They call themselves the shishi, the men of high purpose, shishi means. And they become concerned to try to overthrow the shogunate eventually. They intervene in politics in various kinds of ways. And really the period from 1858 to 1868 are the revolutionary years in Japan. They're very, very confusing and very complicated, and I'm not going to attempt to give you an account, a blow-by-blow account of the many parties and players in this internal struggle. I'll summarize it. I mean, it's a period of local civil wars, of assassinations and executions, in which hundreds of members, above all of the samurai class, lose their lives in internecine struggles amongst themselves. The shishi, this wave of, for the first time, activated samurai from some parts of Japan, particularly from the outer Han, the ones who've traditionally been the enemies of the Tokugawa, they become, initially their slogan is, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, and they try to go about this process of focusing on the emperor and actually attacking the British, attacking the Americans and so on, attacking the Dutch and the rest of it inside Japan. They rapidly find that every time they do this, the price that the imperialist powers demand for any success they have is absolutely massive. And they begin to learn a lesson, which is that instead of trying to expel them, we'll have to be like them. We'll have to learn to compete with them. And eventually, key members of them, after a high death rate amongst this layer, finally get hold of power in a number of the key Han, in the outer areas of Japan, above all Satsuma and Choshu, two areas down to the south and the west of Japan. And they finally get together an army, and they challenge the power of the Tokugawa shoguns, and there's a short battle of 3 days outside Kyoto in January 1868, which they win, and the Tokugawa shogun resigns, and they seize power, and they restore the emperor. And this is the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Now, was this a popular revolution? No. It was a process largely concentrated in the top layer of society, amongst the top 6%. It involved, if you like, intra-class conflict, not inter, but intra-class conflict within the samurai class. It is comparable, I think, to a junior officer's revolt in a modern army. It has much more of that character than it does of a popular revolution. It's accompanied by waves of peasant revolt in different parts of Japan, particularly in the couple of years before actually the new government takes power, and also of urban artisans' revolt. But one has to say that those revolts of peasants and urban artisans and so on never form in the way like we can say the levellers do in England in the 17th century. They don't form they don't get together national political demands. They're focused on local grievances about exploiting landlords, about exploiting merchants and so on. They never focus on the power of the samurai class. They never challenge for state power, and they never develop out of themselves a direct program for state power. They have slogans which talk about world renewal and so on, but they don't actually, in the same way, you might say if you compare them with the Chiapas revolt this year, which immediately emerges with a national set of demands, in fact a set of demands which relate to the world economy, you can't say that about the peasant movements and the artisan movements of the 1860s in Japan. It's not till after not till the 1880s really, you begin to see the emergence of popular parties, even then very much distorted by samurai dominance and so on. The merchants and the bourgeoisie play no direct political part in the process of the seizure of power. The new rulers form a very narrow layer within Japanese society. They're middle samurai. They're people who've previously been excluded from power in the old system, but only a minority of them who take power. And they come only from a few of the Han within Japan. And they really set about rebuilding Japanese society, rebuilding the state, using the emperor as a symbol of national imperial authority. They used the emperor, quite simply, as a symbol for Japanese unification. I think the closest analogy, possibly, to their role in history is something like the Nasser's revolt in Egypt in the 1950s, or perhaps Kemal Ataturk's revolution in Turkey after the First World War, about which I am remarkably uninformed, I have to say. But I have this sense that, from the little I have read, that Those are the kinds of analogies you might look to for this kind of revolution. They did not, when they took power, behead the aristocracy. They didn't draw the lords of Japan to Edo, which they renamed Tokyo, in tumbrils and chop them off. No, they pensioned them off. They took away their powers, they took away their lands, and they pensioned them off with state bonds. They did the same to the samurai class. They betrayed their own class, basically. They wiped out the privileges of their own class. They created a modern citizenry. They declared that all Japanese citizens in the future were equal, and therefore equally, of course, liable to pay taxes, and equally liable to be conscripted into the army, and equally required to be subordinate to the new government, and so on. But they were a section of the class that, in the name of what the American sociologists of the 1950s used to call modernization, betrayed their own class in a sense. They were dependent, in order to do this, on developing a new armed force. They had to take away the samurai's privilege of carrying weapons and make it a state monopoly. And to that they had to arm the peasantry in a conscript army. They had to put down all kinds of resistance. There were waves of resistance from the samurai class themselves, or at least 4 rebellions from different sections of the samurai class over the next 10 years. There was one which lasted a pitched war for 6 months in Satsuma, for example, as late as 1877. Always the samurai forces were defeated by these new peasant conscript forces, and so on. There were waves of peasant revolt against the new economic conditions, and so on. Again, they used their peasant army to put down the peasantry, and so on. The level of resistance they had to face led to them emerging as a very narrow, very authoritarian, closed, narrow ruling group, some of whom lasted into the early 20th century. They were most of them young. They were in their 20s and 30s. When they did this, they lasted into the 20th century, and those who didn't get assassinated by their enraged former class colleagues, became known as the Genro, the old men. They were a very curious and interesting class. They developed industry. If they had done it in the 20th century, there would have been people outside the building from one of these mad sects saying that Japan was a socialist country, because they used the state to develop industry. The first industries developed in Japan were nationalized industries, and there would have been people who would have talked about a degenerated worker state, no doubt, in Japan, had they had that daft idea in the 19th century. Once they'd secured their position at home, then they began to expand outwards. They were initially very careful not to do so. They had a big internal fight over this question in the early 1870s, but in the 1880s and the 1890s and the early 1900s, we see the imperialist expansion of Japan. They had a war with Korea, then war with China, and finally, of course, in 1904, 1905, there's a war with Russia, in which they sink the Russian Navy. They've so developed their economic military power, they can take on the power of Tsarist Russia, sink the Russian Navy, beat the Russians, and of course set off the processes which will in part contribute to the launching of the 1905 revolution in Russia. They represent, just to conclude, because I know the chair is getting anxious now, an early form of state capitalism in important senses. Their slogan, if they had lasted that long, have reflected, if they could have seen into history in the future, they could have said, Stalin's slogan is our slogan. What was Stalin's slogan? The imperialist countries are simply rushing ahead with technology. We must catch up with them and overtake them, or they will destroy us. That could have been their slogan. And they did, as Stalin did, which use the power of the state, concentrate the force of the state on developing a more modern system of exploitation, a more modern system of industrial development, a more modern army and navy, and in the 20th century, air force, and so on. The logic was a completely capitalistic one, of course. They used the state as an instrument of competition and accumulation. Why was it possible for this to happen in Japan? I think for this reason, it is worth referring back to the nature of Tokugawa society in that previous 250 years, because the samurai had become a non-property class, interestingly. They had become a class which was attached to state office. They were, in fact, bureaucrats. They were military bureaucrats, in a sense. They were officers, you might say, of an officer class. They had already, and they had no difficulty, therefore, in transferring their loyalty from a particular local han or to the shogunate to the new Japanese state, and using the power that they had as state officials to direct Japanese development. They were right-wing, extremely right-wing, they were extremely authoritarian, they were extremely nationalist, and they were revolutionaries. As such, they were revolutionaries. And they became an inspiration to other revolutionaries in Asia. Sun Yat-sen, for example, at the turn of the century, said of himself and his colleagues in the Chinese revolutionary movement, "We are the Shishi of China. We are the men of high purpose of China," looking to Japan as a model, which, as it happens, they were not able to follow. They were not pleasant people, but then bourgeois revolutions are not very pleasant occasions. They're not necessarily very pleasant, important issues. Let me end with a question. This is in a series called Great Bourgeois Revolutions. Was this a great bourgeois revolution? It wasn't, if our measure of that is the question, were brilliant new ideas new enlightened ideas about freedom and democracy and so on launched by this revolution? The answer is no, not in that sense. But in the effects of this revolution, I think you have to say it was a great revolution in the development of capitalism. It enabled the first non-European power to develop. And it was part of the process by which capitalism became a genuinely world exploitative and competitive system against which we now struggle.
Let's open up the meeting now for people if you want to ask questions or make a contribution, anything people are not clear about. We've got plenty of time.
Why did you restore the emperor that was the sort of forgotten figure in sort of internal exile, it seemed? Was that to give them some sort of legitimacy so that they could go back to a past tradition, and that would sort of encourage people to regard them as a ruling task?
I've got a question. One, what did the powers like America and Britain, what did they think of the Restoration? Or were they quite happy to keep the capitalist Japan, or did they nothing to do?
There's a couple of questions there. I'd like to wait for the speaker to come back on it if anybody wants to answer them.
What values existed in the 1600s that made a peasant hold the highest status than the artisan and the merchant?
With the king, the emperor, Meiji, I would have thought that the very fact that he had no precise actual power in his court made a very good choice for the samurai to use as a figurehead than any political force, because they were the man who everyone knew about. No one knew what the hell he did. He couldn't actually go out and do it himself. He was stuck there. So they go along there and say, we'll take you around the country, you do what you like, give you a bit of money, just do what we say. I mean, obviously not, I'm sure it wasn't as simple as that, but I think it comes down to that kind of thing, in the sense that he wanted a life, and they wanted a figurehead, and two people came together through the nature of the social structure at the time. The question I want to ask really is, I know there's been a lot of questions, but here's another one. When the samurai were organising the Restoration, were they doing it, the precise manner they did it, was it because they just thought, well, here we are, we want to get rid of imperialists, this seems like a good idea of doing it, a capitalist show? Or did they sit down with their Adam Smiths and their Karl Marx and read up the classical works and think, well, the book says we should do it like this?
Come over the back.
Yeah, but sort of partial answer to why the artisans and merchants were considered to be lower than the peasants. I think it's essentially down to the fact that we're talking about a society dominated by the aristocracy, whose wealth is based on taxing the peasantry, is based on land. I mean, it's not something that's confined to Japan. You just can't look to medieval Europe. The people who were contested most were the Jews. The Jews were the people who were handling the money, It was something that the aristocracy at the time was very dependent on these people. They didn't need money for things. But it was rather disgusting, these people who actually played a part in society, but they didn't have anything to do with land, whether truly know the people who might know well from. I think it's to do with it's that level of thing. Peasants are peasants are doing proper work at providing money that the aristocracy can take off them. Merchants are actually, lending aristocrats money and expecting interest back from them.
Comment, Gavin, you have a shot.
You've given a very clear account of the sort of political revolution that took place. But, somebody who knows nothing about Japan whatsoever, really, what seems to be left out is the sort of economic development that occurred during this restoration. Because, as I understood, sort of most of the bourgeois revolutions of Europe, you have this building up of wealth amongst the merchant classes of Europe, and their gradual sort of establishment of universities, which sort of centres of learning, which for all sorts of reasons that you described couldn't actually take place in Japan. But how did the wealth actually arise to build capitalism in Japan, albeit state capitalism? Was there a very brutal primitive accumulation of wealth from the peasantry which actually then took place? And were the merchants involved in this at all, or did they just sort of get wiped out of the story by these new samurai ruling classes?
I was going to ask sort of along the same lines about the nature of how the first accumulation of capital took place in Japan. I think that what struck me about Colin's talk was that there was a lot, because it was about a non-European transition to capitalism, there are things that are extremely dissimilar, but also that are similar. Something like what happened in Germany, it really strikes me as resemblances to the Bismarck state-led transition in Germany. There's real parallels, but I wanted to ask about the nature of the mode of production before the pre-1868 mode of production in Japan. How would you characterize it? Because it's interesting, this is an aristocracy, but it's a state aristocracy that provides its revenue through extractive mechanisms through taxation. And then the transformation of those relations of production, capitalist relations of production, what happens in the peasantry, how was their life affected by that, what did it mean? And how was that related to the rise of commercial or industrial capitalism? It seems to me there also must be implications for how we understand in terms of the theory of transition from a free capital class society to capitalism here and also in Europe, because of all the debates around the transition in Europe. It seems to me there's an interesting question.
What little I know about Japanese history tends to put a different picture on the analysis that you give, because the assumption that you make is that there is a struggle in this 6%, between this 6%, between different layers of the samurai class, and somehow, at the end of it, a capitalist class benefits from these struggles. Although that capitalist class, merchants and traders and so on, start off presumably at the bottom of the pecking order, they suddenly become, as it were, invited into the top of the pecking order and then given free rein to go ahead and develop their own industries. The question that occurs to me is that if you're trying to get into competition with world imperialism by copying world imperialism, or world imperialist countries, if you like, the question has to be raised, where was their empire? Did they have any empire in Korea? When did that start? Were they able to bring that the wealth on that empire into the process of any state? Or the later empire that they developed in China, were they able to, in some way, as a trading nation? And I think this is what they largely were. They became very powerful. So you mentioned their naval fleet, but their merchant fleet grew very, very rapidly between that revolution and the First World War. During the First World War, they were building ships, as they did after the Second World War. They were building ships 5 times the size of the British ships, average British ships, during the First World War. And also, as a result of that First World War, they were viciously excluded by a racist French delegate to the Versailles Treaty from any share in the spoils of that war, who said he didn't think these yellow people should benefit from the Great War and develop an empire of their own. So that they were, it seemed they were excluded very, very largely from the process of imperialist expansion. And how did they get this tremendous growth in the economy in the following 30 or 40 years, without throwing up through the state, you've obviously asked that question, but without throwing up a large working class in the process that intervened in some way in the whole revolutionary development?
Yes, to do with the question of the mode of production in Japan before the revolution. I mean, like everyone else, I'm so shocked in real reading on Japan. One thing I have read is Terry Anderson's discussion when he was the obsolete state, where he argues that Japan was actually a feudal state and feudal mode of production history. In fact, he argues that one of the reasons it was capable of making the transition to capitalism precisely because it was the only Asian state that actually had feudalism, because it sees things to be very connected. Now, it might have been undermined as an argument, but then you ought to see that feudal rank by local feudal law as soon as the distribution of feudal Europe. And that's generally the kind of things that could be very good at rather than feudal. And you see that that's correct. In fact, it's a distinction. It doesn't seem to make much difference to the peasants, because obviously when they'll use them for creating a lot of money or anyway, but it does that, it obviously has a significance in the ruling class itself. And from that, would they have been able to make the transition? Would the revolution have been able to? Because without the outside pressure, because it's purely something that has to do with this external pressure coming on. And one final thing, I think, is to do with Dallas Collin's argument, which you mentioned at the beginning, where in his article, he tends to stress the idea of a revolution, those revolutions included, involving very much the sort of smashing of the state and construction of a new state by the revolutionary classes, or some analogous grouping of where the old world is. But what seems to be the case in Japan, and also this extent in Germany and America at a similar time, and also in Italy, is that it isn't a struggle against some state that they are fighting against, but actually a struggle within sections of the state, which are quite different geographical areas. I mean, the Samurai appear to have been involved to a certain extent within the state apparatus themselves in terms of raising taxes and so on. So, I mean, is that correct, or is this a mistaken view?
No, I was wondering if Colin wants to give a bit more information about what the attitude of the Western imperialist powers was to the revolution that was taking place, and then try to actually intervene which I would feel also whether basically how the Western imperialists dealt with after that restoration, whether they sort of necessarily expelled, did they come to some sort of agreement with the cast? It seems to me that what Colin has described is actually something which only a tradition of analysis which sees capitalism as the world economy can possibly grasp. As if we don't have to see what happens in Japan as entirely driven internally as the first breakthroughs to capitalism in the first great cultural revolutions are. Because the interesting thing is, the previous comrade mentioned some of the other historical examples. The decade of the 1860s itself, I would argue, is a decade in which you see a number of bourgeois revolutions from above designed to refashion the state and unify markets precisely in order that indigenous capitalist classes can develop, rather than simply being colonized in some way by the world market and ultimately by the large imperial power. To say, the 1860s is the decade of the unification of Germany, the establishment of unified political structure in a larger market. The same thing with respect to Italy. In the case of Canada, it is 4 British colonies which are knitted together from above. And then you get this case that Colin is describing in Japan. Probably the only case where one can argue that you have the continuation of some sort of mass revolution movement from below during this decade is the U.S. With the American Civil War, and particularly its transformation into a revolutionary war to break the Confederacy in the South, and so on, particularly the emancipation of black population during the later stages of the war, and so on. There are even elements of the revolt from below. But I think it's crucial to recognize that what we're dealing with here is situations in which already the world economy is having this massive impact on existing states which are not yet adequately transformed to create a geographic territory which is governed in a uniform way by a more rationalized bureaucratic regime which administers one single economic market of sufficient size in order to be able to peak, certainly in the case of Canada's revolution from above in 1867, besides the fact that these little colonies on their own aren't finished, unless there's an attempt by some larger ruling class to unify them in order to stay alive independently. Now, I don't know enough about Japanese economic history, and I'd like you to comment on some of the other questions, but it would seem to me, obviously, to be the case that capitalist development must, therefore, have involved greater concentration of land, dispossession of sections of peasantry, the emergence of an indigenous proletariat, and so on over time. I have no idea what the basis of that sort of process is. I think for us, we need to recognize that this actually fits very nicely with all the tradition of analysis that we have about the way in which the world economy dominates its component parts.
Yes, just a couple of observations and questions. Going back to the first question about use of the Meiji Emperor's symbol, came into my mind the lines from the 18th Brumaire, the tradition of all the declarations, weighing like a nightmare on the brain of the living, and what Marx then goes on to say about that is how actually in our bourgeois revolutions, also people look back, not in this case to an emperor, but in the English Revolution, people spoke in the language of the Old Testament. In the French Revolution, they dressed themselves in the garb of classical Rome and so on, like what was neat. While they were essentially moving forward, doing something new, they thought of themselves in the terms of the past. The question of a bourgeois revolution not made by the bourgeoisie is important for us, I think also in terms of, Colin said, first state capitalist enterprise. It's important in terms of the theory of deflected permanent revolution. It's important when you come to relate this to the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, because a lot of people simply say, how could the Cuban Revolution be essentially a bourgeois revolution, or how is its outcome on state capitalist society when there were no, there clearly wasn't capitalist leading it, and so on. So that's what I just want to ask a question. If you covered it, I missed it, I apologize. But was there a relationship here between the merchants and the samurai? Was there a relationship of funding and so on going on there? So that seems to me something I thought of. That's one question. The second question, Colin or anybody else knows about it, is that a long time ago I remember seeing a photograph in 1904 during at the time of the war between Russia and Japan, when Plekhanov, the founder of Russian Marxism, was shaking hands with a Japanese socialist as a sort of symbol of international solidarity. So by the time you get to 1904, there clearly was a Japanese socialist movement, about which I know nothing. I don't know if anybody can say anything about that.
Follow there.
Yeah, I wanted to follow on from the questions about the sort of economy that the Meiji Restoration set up. So I was interested in what Colin had to say, because the Japanese economy and the success of it really mesmerises the ruling class in the West. And what you get is this sort of pernicious racist myth that the success of the Japanese economy is because these people basically copy all the good Western ideas and then knock everything out cheaper. And that's somehow what explains the growth of Japanese capitalism. I think the way in which the ruling class very single-mindedly set out accomplishing those tasks is a useful antidote to that. But the question following on from that was, did the American occupation after the Second World War make any substantial change to the economy that was the legacy of the Meiji Restoration? And then the second question really was, we have a tradition about arguing against the great bourgeois revolutions in the West. We have to defend the idea that the English Revolution actually was a revolution. There's the defence of the tradition of the Jacobins in the French Revolution against all these people who say it was mere barbarism and chaos. Is there any similar debate in Japan about the status of the Meiji Restoration? Is it, a tradition that, socialists in that part of the world right now have to defend? Or, what's their attitude to it? That was the second question.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the question of the bourgeois ruling class, surely we're permitted to look at Japan and see the emergence of a new bourgeoisie without necessarily saying this must have come from the merchants. I mean, especially a state-led introduction of capitalism. Because, I mean, obviously, we've had other examples of Russia and so on. But a state-led introduction of capitalism, which involved members of the old warrior class, all of whom were pensioned up, as Colin was saying, many of whom, in other words, presumably have had, lots of money in their hands the first time, which actually, in some cases, they could use to invest and become new capitalists themselves in tandem, with the state-driven, development of the economy. In other words, a new bourgeoisie surely can rise, directly out of that class, which has actually changed its status in society. And I think that sort of question is worth spending time on, precisely because revolution is today. I mean, when we look back at bourgeois revolution, we see the development of bourgeois society and capitalist society and so on very often unconsciously. The players are unconscious of what they're doing, whereas we as revolutionary socialists will have to transform society in an entirely conscious way, working inside bourgeois society.
The question is the thing about the Great Bourgeois Revolution, because the way I see it, 1848 was crucially different. 1848 was crucially different to what happened in Japan. 1848 was the last time that bourgeois revolution led to the movement from below, also developing that the merchant classes could control, and that because it was going out of control, the merchant classes at the end of it sold out the revolution. But there was elements of change from below. And what you were saying about you did explain in your account of the Japanese revolution, if the actions of the samurai led to peasants and so on trying to put their own alternatives on, and I know they can't create an alternative fight and so on, if they led to that kind of movement from below that they had in 1848, it was national in 1848, but also that kind of movement from below, that 78-9 in France actually led to a qualitatively different kind of change in society. 78-9 in France led to breaking of old religious ideas of the monarchy and so on. It was a real flowering of a new age, you can say. And these state-led revolutions, also what the Junkertum did in Germany at the end of the last century, was actually state-led from above, but actually didn't allow any kind of movement from below to come at all. So could you say if there was this kind of development from below? Because I think I would say there's a crucial difference. Up to 1848, this possibility or this danger for the emergence of losing control of the situation. And the situation in Japan and Germany at the end of the century that was actually, from the very beginning, very much confined, very much geared to catching up with the rest of the world, and therefore also from the very outset excluded the possibilities of something coming from below.
Right, time's getting on, so I'm just going to take one final contribution from Colin.
Yes. 1868, in 1868, Marx and Engels were still very much alive and active and commenting on events that were happening not only in the bourgeois revolutions from above in France and, in Germany, in Italy, the Civil War in the United States, also writing quite a lot about Asia. I mean, they were not Eurocentric in that sense. They were writing quite extensively about the revolt against imperialism in India and the struggles of China. But as far as I'm not really aware of anything that they ever wrote about Japan. Is there any evidence that they did actually consider this revolution that was going? Perhaps it wasn't quite as clear at the time how dramatic an effect it would have. But I was just wondering if they ever did write anything about it.
Before Colin sums up, just to remind people, if there is anybody in the room by the name of Woody Build, could they go to room 2C in Yulu? And also there's a meeting for all civil servant comrades at 6 o'clock in Yulu Bar.
Right, Christ. I've tried to organise the answers roughly in terms of questions about Tokugawa society, that's pre-1853 society, and then the process. Anyway, I'll see if I can make sense of it all. Why did they restore the emperor? Let's begin with that. Basically, I think the comrade Buck answered it partly. They needed a symbol of legitimacy. This was a powerless figure, very usable. And it wasn't even necessarily a question of dressing themselves up in the, believing themselves to be dressing themselves up in the language of the past. They were pretty conscious and cynical about the thing. I mean, in public, they talked about the emperor. In private, in their conversations with each other, they talked about MP. This is a teenager. This is a guy who's he's a 14-year-old boy. Right, so and when you talk about it, somebody said he wanted a life. Believe me, he didn't have any life, right? He still did what he was told. He made the speeches he was told to from the throne, and so on. He had speechwriters. This was not a powerful figure. He was a creature of this group of people. Okay. The question was asked, why was the peasant placed above the artisan? Basically because this was a system set up at the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century. Town development was relatively low in this period. They were like pre-capitalist physiocrats, if you like, the 17th and the 18th century French thinkers who saw the land and activity on the land as the second noble activity after fighting and ruling. Whereas handling money, trading, urban life, these were seen as degrading. And so they organized their system in terms of they did indeed dress, when they set that system up, they did indeed dress themselves, if you like, in the language of the past. And then the society that grew up around them in this new framework, in fact, began to subvert their very official class system. There was something else about in that sort of area. Yes, about the relation. John asked about the relationship between merchants and samurai in pre-modern Japan. Well, fundamentally, the samurai fell in debt to the merchants. They had to borrow money from the merchants in order to be able to maintain themselves in some kind of material survival in some cases. Some of them were very poor. This ruling layer. They lived in hovels and had to engage secretly in part-time proto-industrial activities, if you like, as part of the commercial economy, without ever, trying to keep it secret and so on, not having their wives and children doing this sort of activity, and so on and so on. And they had to borrow money from the merchants, and the merchants used and from richer peasants, over whom apparently in theory they ruled. And there's a letter in the 1840s from a rich peasant, to a lord, telling him off for the way he's living, and actually saying, we won't be willing to lend you any more money unless you do something about your riotous and luxurious brother. You should just get rid of him. This is, absolutely, there are all these tensions developing in the society, and of course, layers of the samurai class become extremely angry about this, and so on. And this partly affects the way in which somebody asked the question, where did they get their ideas from? Did they get it from, suddenly after 1853, Adam Smith is rapidly translated, or I don't know, John Locke, or even Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto is smuggled in and translated rapidly. No, where did they get their ideas from? They did their own thinking. They'd been doing their own thinking over the previous century at least, in their own language, thinking about the Chinese classics, about Confucius and Mencius and the mandate of heaven and so on, and critically reflecting on the difference between their society and Chinese society, and beginning to be aware of the growing power of the West, and that their society, there's a sense amongst the layers of samurai intellectuals, if you like, and one can talk about the samurais that there's a thinking class. It's not just a military class, it's a thinking class. Sections of it are going to become extremely impressive rulers in capitalist terms. They thought, and they worked things through, and they reformulated their picture of the world. All revolutionaries. Lenin says about socialist revolution, no revolution without revolution theory. It's also true for the bourgeoisie, or for this class, carrying through a bourgeois revolution. They did their own thinking, and we can't say, they borrowed ideas from the West and just, and so on. Actually, they were innovators for their own class. What mode of production was it? And this connects actually with the question about debates amongst Marxists in Japan. There was a great debate in the 1920s and the 1930s about the nature, which has actually rumbled on in Japan right up to today. And anybody who wants to pursue it, there's a not bad book, something like 500-page book in English by an American historian called Jermaine Hostin. And I can give you, if anybody really wants it, I can send you a postcard with the reference. She's also got an article, a fairly major article in an academic journal, which I can refer you to. I haven't got the reference with me, but I can give it to you. There was a huge debate, and in a sense, one side took the Perry Anderson argument about England. And they said, we have had an incomplete bourgeois revolution, and that's the problem. We live in a semi-feudal, semi-absolutist state. And the other group said, no, we've had a bourgeois revolution, and then got into an agony because they couldn't identify a bourgeoisie that had carried it out. And both sides are in a state of semi-confusion. It's quite interesting. I think reading these accounts of these debates, my God, if they only knew about the theory of state capitalism, they should have met Cliff, and they should have met us, and we could have explained it to them, because all sorts of dilemmas they get into in terms of their arguments, they haven't actually in the 20s, because particularly, of course, they're debating within a framework of Trotsky. They have no access to Trotsky. Some of them actually move towards positions, not politically, but in terms of understanding the world, something like notions of combined and uneven development and so on, but they never quite get there. Trotsky is, because of developments inside the Communist International, they haven't really got access adequately to those sorts of ideas, and they're trying to debate within a framework which is more and more constricted by Stalinism, and they can't quite make sense of it. Very interesting debates, and they did some very interesting historical research on which people have built since then. What sort of mode of production was it? Well, I don't think that calling it feudalism is terribly helpful, I must confess. It doesn't. It seems to me it's better to retain the term feudalism for the system that existed in Europe. We have got a system here of state taxation of villages. It has got economic consequences because it means it is a system in which the local representatives of the ruling class have been removed from the countryside. They do not intervene directly in the process of production in the villages. It's one of the things that makes it possible for the peasants to differentiate internally for a landlord. I didn't have time to talk about this. A landlord class emerges effectively from amongst the peasantry, living in the villages, owning the land and renting it out in small parcels to tenants. One of the things which the Meiji Restoration did within 3 or 4 years was to completely reorganize the landholding system in Japan and legalize private property in land so they could tax it for the government. And the first thing they had to do was to identify who owned the land. And what they did was to say that those rich peasants now owned the land. And so there becomes a legally defined, they created a legal framework for the development of modern capitalism, not on the scale of English landlordism. I mean, these are much smaller landlords. There are far more of them. These are not the great lords with their mighty estates and so on. These are smaller guys, but there are a lot of them, and they provide a source of, they suck rents out of their tenants, and they're the ones who pay the taxes to the governments as landowners. They're also the people who partly accumulate the capital resources, which are then turned into industrial development and trading development and so on and so on. And they're quite a dynamic force in pre-modern Japanese development and also under the Meiji Restoration. It's a government. I mean, some of the Marxists of the 1920s talked about a landlord-emperor system in Japan as a key part of the whole process. Sorry, I'm getting through this. We've got to there. The term tributary production has been suggested. Tributary mode of production. I think it's better, actually. I mean, probably the best thing to do is, first of all, try and describe very exactly what the system was, and then worry about labels. But the term Perry Anderson, with his notion that it was feudal, I think is decidedly unhelpful, because basically what he's trying to say is, because there was feudalism in Europe and there was feudalism in Japan, only in those two circumstances could capitalism develop. Well, I think that's a pretty thin theory, particularly as it doesn't look like European feudalism at all. And I think the whole theory, it borrows it partly from Barrington-Moore, who's rather unreliable on Japan as well. And I think the Barrington-Moore-Anderson thesis should be, as far as Japan's concerned, should be forgotten. As for Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they knew nothing about it at all. And they have nothing to say. I mean, I think Marx actually did say Japanese feudalism at one point. He didn't know anything about it. And, I could make remarks about life on the moon, and it would be equally relevant, and prove, and if you want to argue when I'm dead about, whether I got it right or wrong, you can. Marx didn't know anything about it. Engels, and it's a very important question. Why didn't they know anything about it? Because it didn't matter in Europe. You see, India mattered fantastically to the European power. This is one of the reasons why it was possible for the Japanese to develop, because there was a space for them to do so within world capitalism in this period. They talked about this as the decade of the American Civil War. That means the Americans are not looking at Japan. This is the period of all sorts of troubles for the British in India. The British are not looking at Japan. It's a period of the Taiping Rebellion in China. Much more important for the European powers than what's happening in Japan. What the British and the Americans and particularly the British and French are the major players in Japanese politics in the 1860s want is stable Japan. They want a place where they can be pretty sure that the government will protect them from having their heads chopped off when they go into the interior of Japan on trading missions. It's not anyway a terribly important market. It's a bit exotic. The main thing is it should be stable. And if some group of people seize power and pretty quickly, after a 3-day battle, stabilise a new government, don't go around chopping off hundreds of heads, there aren't massive popular rebellions and the rest of it, establish what they recognise as a reasonable legal system, who cares very much? It's, it's an offshore island off Asia. It's not where the riches of Asia are to be found and so on. It hasn't got major mineral resources. It isn't a great empire. It's a tiny little empire. It doesn't matter to them too much. Actually, they're lucky. They're given this space. The powers in Europe are getting ready for the Franco-Prussian War in this period, and so on. Attention is diverted elsewhere. There's a space, precisely because this is, in some ways, a revolutionary decade in world capitalist history. It creates a space for the Japanese, and that's also, therefore, Karl Marx's attention is not drawn to it. For the same sorts of reasons. He watches it. He's fascinated by the Taiping Rebellion. He's fascinated and has very important things to say about the revolts in the Indian Army and so on. In India, who cares about Japan? You know, I mean, there must be similar places where there may be very important things happening for the future in some parts of the world, and we don't notice them either for rather similar reasons, because actually at this moment they don't seem to count very much in terms of world politics and the rest of it. Often too, you look at the lack of attention in the world's press to East Timor, for example. You know, we have to fight for East Timor to be noted. The left have to fight for it. The capital think the shit about East Timor. It doesn't matter to them. You know, okay, they go and murder a few people. Who cares? Nothing to do with that. Not significant. You know, it's not part of our big game. And Japan has a rather similar status, I think, in that sort of thing. Okay, quickly, because this is getting very boring for you. Anyway, how are they able to grow? How are they able to grow? You have to remember something. When we say this is a backward society, it is only a relatively backward society. This is in the 90s. They haven't got the leap forward to make that, for example, Russia's got to make in the 20th century. In some ways, this is a society in which there's been a lot of commercial development. It's one of the most, outside Europe, it's probably the society with the highest level of literacy, for example, amongst the population. Large numbers of peasants have already learned to read. They have not got that much catching up to do. It isn't such a gap. This is the 19th century, not the 20th century. There has not been that enormous process of further industrial development that happens in the advanced capitalist world in the latter part of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, which is sometimes called monopoly capitalism, and which is associated with the development of electric power. They participate in all of that as relative equals. They're able to do so. There isn't such a gap to catch up, and so on and so on. So it's important to remember that. The landlords and so on, and the quite small capital accumulations, together with the state, it provides sufficient impetus for them for the take-off process, if you like, towards modern capitalist development. And that's also significant. Did they develop an empire? Surely they certainly did. You ask the Chinese. You know, within 2 decades, they had seized Formosa in modern Taiwan as part of their empire. They were at war with Korea, they were into Manchuria, etc., etc., etc. They were a petty imperialism compared with the great imperialist powers, and nonetheless, they were an imperialist power. And of course, by the time we get to the 1930s, they have ambitions for the control of the whole of Asia. And there's a war. Half of the Second World War is precisely about the battle over the imperialist control of Asia and the Pacific, and so on. So certainly they did. Certainly there is, of course, industrialization and so on does involve the development of a working class, and we do see the emergence in Japan of a working class, and therefore a working class movement, and so on, but it is in conditions which are familiar to us from many countries in which there are militaristic governments and so on. They operate under terrible repression and the rest of it, and it's a real hard struggle to get. And there's never a real breakthrough in all sorts of ways, in terms of mass working class organisation in many sectors of industry and so on and so on. But very, very fierce repression of socialists, people being murdered in police stations, the usual sorts of stories that we're all too familiar with about the fate of the left. They're facing repressive, authoritarian development governments. You know, let's be quite clear about it. Capitalist development is often a horrible process in terms of what it does to people. And this is true also of China. Last question. So somebody asked how much revolution from below? Not a lot. End of that. Last question about the US occupation. Yes, it did make a difference in 2 very important respects. Firstly, the landlord system, which the Americans intervened, and initially they said we're going to promote democracy. Okay, and they abolished the landlord system, and there was an encouragement of small peasant farming, which is these days one of the most efficient small peasant farming systems in the world. Because actually Japanese farms, even to this day, are micro farms compared with, obviously the United States or Canada, but even with Britain. They're very, very small farms because of the hilly character of the terrain and so on, particular relative efficiencies of rice production and so on. They promoted a kind of second modernization of agriculture and then, of course, came the Korean War. And suddenly, American capital flooded into Japan. It was part of the process by which Japan, whose economy had been absolutely shattered by the war. I mean, you have to understand the level of poverty and starvation that existed in Japan immediately after the war. It was much worse than Europe. But actually there's an enormous revival because of the American interest in having a reliable power just off the shore from Korea, and that became absolutely crucial in generating the process which started the extraordinary expansion of Japan in the years after the war. And I think I've covered everything, and if I haven't, I apologize for the after.